Talvarus Oakum pressed his face against the cold crystal viewport and watched the stars burn above the dying world of Kethris 7. He had never seen so much destruction in his young life, and he wondered if this was how all wars ended, with fire and silence and the slow death of hope. He was a historian, not a soldier. His people, the Volanthi, had given up warfare 10,000 years ago when they learned that violence solved nothing and created only more pain. Now they watched and recorded and tried to remember the lessons that others refused to learn. The observation deck of the diplomatic cruiser Serenities Whisper hummed with quiet energy as holographic displays flickered with data streams and casualty reports. Talvarus tried not to look at the numbers, because the numbers made his stomach turn and his four hearts ache with sorrow. Another colony lost, whispered Ambassador Kethril, her silver scales catching the light of distant explosions. The Zathrak Dominion grows stronger with each world they consume, and we grow weaker with each life we fail to protect. The Zathrak have been devouring civilizations for 300 years. They were insects in form massive, chitinous nightmares, with razor limbs and hive minds that thought only of conquest and consumption. They had broken the proud Morvathi Empire in a single decade. They had silenced the singing cities of Velos Prime. They had turned 100 beautiful worlds into breeding pits for their endless armies. The Galactic Concordance, a coalition of 12 elder species, had tried everything to stop them. They had used diplomacy and weapons and even forbidden technologies that twisted the fabric of space itself. Nothing worked because the Zathrak did not negotiate, and they did not fear, and they absolutely did not stop Tal. Varys turned away from the viewport and walked to his personal console where a notification light blinked with urgent news. He touched the screen and read the message twice because he could not believe what it said. Ambassador, he called out, his voice trembling with confusion. There is a report here that says reinforcements are coming to Kethris 7. Kethril looked up from her own console with eyes that held no hope. More concordant ships will not save this world, young one. We have already lost the orbital stations and half the ground forces. These are not concordant ships, Talvarus replied, scrolling through the data. They are from a species called humans. They volunteered to help. The word spread through the observation deck like a strange wind. Officers and diplomats gathered around Talvarus as he pulled up everything the Concordance database had on these humans. The file was small, almost insultingly small for a spacefaring species. Humans had only discovered faster than light travel 200 years ago. They came from a small blue world called Earth in an unremarkable corner of the galaxy. Their technology was crude by Concordance standards, relying on chemical propulsion and kinetic weapons that threw metal instead of energy. Persistence predators, Talvarus read aloud from the biological assessment. They evolved on a world where they hunted prey by chasing it until it collapsed from exhaustion. They are omnivores with unusual endurance and a high tolerance for pain and environmental extremes. Admiral Vexthos, a towering Morvathi with battle scars across his blue carapace, let out a rumbling laugh. Persistence predators who throw rocks at their enemies. This is what the galaxy sends to save Kethris 7. We might as well surrender now and spare these primitives the embarrassment. How many ships are they sending? Asked Tethraltal. Varys checked the number and felt his hope deflate like a punctured balloon. 30 vessels, Ambassador. 30 ships against the Zathrak Armada. The Zathrak had over 1,200 warships in orbit around Kethris 7. Their ground forces numbered in the tens of millions. Sending 30 ships against such a force was not bravery, it was suicide. Perhaps they do not understand what they face, suggested one of the junior diplomats. Perhaps someone should warn them to turn back. Before anyone could respond, the sensor officer shouted a warning. New contacts dropping from hyperspace. Bearing 773. It is them. It is the human fleet. Talvarus rushed back to the viewport and watched as 30 small vessels tore through the fabric of reality and emerged into normal space. They were ugly ships, all sharp angles and exposed armor plating and bristling weapon pods. They looked like they had been built by creatures who expected to fight and expected to be hurt and did not care about either. The Zythrak responded instantly. A swarm of fighter craft rose from the orbital stations like angry hornets defending their nest. The Hive Admiral broadcast a message on all frequencies. His clicking mandibles translated into cold mechanical speech. Unidentified vessels, you have entered Zythrak territory. Surrender your ships and your lives, or be destroyed. This is not a negotiation. This is a statement of fact. Talvarus held his breath and waited for the humans to respond. Surely they would see reason. Surely they would recognize that this battle was already lost, and that their lives could be better spent elsewhere. Surely they would. The human response came through on every channel in every known language, and Talvarus felt something strange crawl down his spine when he heard it. Come and take it. That was all. 3 words broadcast with absolute calm, as if the humans were not looking at certain death, but at an interesting challenge. As if 1,200 warships and millions of soldiers were not a threat, but an opportunity. Admiral Vexthos stopped laughing. What did they say? They said, come and take it, Talvarus repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. I believe it is a challenge. The Zythrak armada began to move. Fighters screamed toward the human fleet while capital ships charged their weapons and troop transports, prepared for planetary assault. It was going to be a massacre. Everyone on the observation deck knew it, but Talvarus could not look away. Something about those 30 ugly ships held his attention. Something about those 3 defiant words made him want to watch what happened next. The human fleet did not retreat. They did not scatter. They did not even try to evade the incoming swarm. Instead, they accelerated directly toward the enemy, their primitive engines burning bright against the darkness of space. They are insane. Breathed Ambassador Kethrall. Talvarus was not sure she was wrong, but he was also not sure she was right, because there was something in the way those ships moved, something purposeful and hungry, and utterly without fear, that made him wonder if perhaps the humans knew something that the rest of the galaxy did not. The first missiles launched. The first beams fired. The first explosions bloomed like flowers of light in the void. And Talvarus Okun, young historian of the Volanthi people, began to record what he believed would be humanity's final hour. He could not have been more wrong. The shuttle shook and rattled as it descended through the burning atmosphere of Kethra 7, and Talvarus gripped his seat restraints so hard that his knuckles turned white. He had asked permission to observe the ground battle from close range, and now he was beginning to regret that decision. Ambassador Kethrall had warned him that the surface was dangerous. She had told him that historians belonged in archives, not on battlefields. But Talvarus needed to understand these humans, needed to see them with his own eyes, instead of through sensor data and second-hand reports. The shuttle pilot, a nervous concordance officer with trembling hands, announced their approach to Firebase Echo. We will land in 3 minutes. Please prepare for immediate disembarkation. The Zythrak have artillery in range, and we cannot stay on the ground for long. Talvarus unstrapped himself the moment the shuttle touched down. The rear hatch opened, and he stepped out into a world that looked like something from a nightmare. The sky was choked with smoke and ash. The ground was scarred with craters and littered with the bodies of the fallen. The distant thunder of explosions never stopped. Not even for a moment a human soldier approached him immediately. She was tall for her species, with dark skin and close-cropped hair, and eyes that seemed to look right through him. Her armor was dented and scorched and covered in dried blood that Talvarus hoped was not her own. You the observer? She asked, her voice rough and direct. I am Talvarus Okun of the Volanthi Diplomatic Corps. I am here to document. Yeah, I know why you are here, she interrupted. I am Captain Elena Vasquez. I'm supposed to keep you alive long enough to write your report. Try not to make that job harder than it needs to be. She turned and walked toward the firebase without waiting for a response. Talvarus hurried to follow her, his forelegs struggling to keep pace with her long strides. Firebase Echo was a fortress of metal and determination. Walls of reinforced steel surrounded a central command post where soldiers worked frantically to coordinate defenses and treat the wounded. Everywhere Talvarus looked, he saw humans checking weapons, humans eating meals, humans laughing and joking as if they were not surrounded by an army that wanted to devour them. That was the first thing that disturbed him. They were laughing. How could anyone laugh in a place like this? He watched a group of soldiers sitting in a circle, their weapons laid across their laps as one of them played a small stringed instrument and sang a song in a language Talvarus did not recognize. The melody was sad and beautiful and completely out of place in this hell of fire and death. Why do they sing? He asked Captain Vasquez. She glanced at the soldiers and shrugged. Because we might die tomorrow. Because the song reminds them of home. Because it makes them feel human. Pick whatever answer you like, but are they not afraid? Vasquez stopped walking and turned to face him. Her eyes were calm and steady and held something that Talvarus could not identify, something that looked almost like hunger. Of course they are afraid, she said. Fear is natural. Fear keeps you sharp. But fear is not the same as defeat. My soldiers are terrified, and they will fight anyway. That is the difference between us and every other species in this galaxy. Before Talvarus could respond, a warning siren split the air. Soldiers scrambled for defensive positions as officers shouted orders. Captain Vasquez grabbed his arm and pulled him toward a reinforced bunker. First wave incoming, she said. Stay down, stay quiet, and try not to die. Talvarus crouched behind a barrier and looked out across the ash plains beyond the firebase. What he saw made his blood freeze. The Zythrak were coming. They emerged from the smoke like a living tide, millions of chitinous bodies moving in perfect synchronization. Their claws clicked against the ground in a rhythm that sounded like death itself. Their mandibles clacked with hunger. Their compound eyes reflected the fires that burned across the battlefield. The Concordance advisors in the command post began broadcasting urgent messages. All forces recommend immediate tactical withdrawal. Enemy numbers exceed defensive capacity by factor of 100. Repeat, recommend immediate withdrawal. Captain Vasquez ignored the message. Instead, she raised her rifle and checked its ammunition. All units, this is Vasquez. Hold your fire until they reach the red markers. Then give them everything you have. Captain, called one of the Concordance officers. You cannot hold against those numbers. You must retreat while you still can. Vasquez looked at the officer with something that might have been pity. We do not retreat. We do not know how. The Zythrak tide crashed against the firebase defenses, and the world exploded into chaos. Talvarus had seen recordings of battles before. He had studied military tactics and strategic maneuvers in the safety of academic halls. But nothing had prepared him for the reality of war, the noise, the smell, the sheer overwhelming violence of creatures trying to kill each other. The humans fought like nothing he had ever witnessed. They did not hide behind their walls and fire from safety. They charged forward to meet the enemy, closing the distance until they were fighting at arm's length. Their kinetic weapons roared and thundered, tearing through Zythrak carapaces with brutal efficiency. When their guns ran empty, they used blades and fists and teeth. He watched a young soldier, barely more than a child by Volante standards, leap onto the back of a Zythrak warrior and drive a knife into the joint between its head and thorax. The creature thrashed and screamed. But the human held on until the light faded from its compound eyes. He watched a medic drag a wounded comrade to safety, while firing a pistol with her other hand. Her face twisted with fury and determination. When a Zythrak lunged at her, she beat it to death with the empty weapon. He watched Captain Vasquez wade into a swarm of enemies. Her rifle spitting fire, her voice raised in a wordless battle cry that echoed across the chaos. She took wounds. A claw raked across her arm. A bite tore at her leg, but she did not stop, did not slow, did not even seem to notice the pain. The Concordance advisors kept calling for retreat. The humans kept ignoring them. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Talvarus could not tell. Time had lost all meaning in the thunder and the blood. But slowly, impossibly, the Zythrak tide began to recede. The creatures pulled back, leaving mountains of their dead behind. When the sun finally set behind the smoke-choked horizon, Firebase Echo still stood. Captain Vasquez walked back to where Talvarus was hiding. She was covered head to toe in alien blood, her armor cracked, her body trembling with exhaustion. But she was smiling, actually smiling, as if she had just finished a pleasant walk instead of a battle for survival. That was just the warm-up, she said, wiping gore from her face. The real fight starts tomorrow. You still want to stay and watch, little historian? Talvarus looked at the bodies scattered across the battlefield. He looked at the wounded humans being carried to medical tents. He looked at Captain Vasquez and her terrible, beautiful smile. Yes, he heard himself say. I want to understand. Vasquez laughed a harsh, honest sound. Good luck with that. We have been trying to understand ourselves for 200,000 years. Let me know if you figure it out. She walked away, and Talvarus sat in the blood-soaked dirt and wondered what kind of creatures could laugh in a place like this. The night was quiet, except for the distant rumble of orbital bombardment and the soft sounds of humans preparing for the next day's battle. Talvarus sat in a corner of the medical tent and watched the wounded being treated. His mind still struggling to process everything he had witnessed. A human soldier sat down beside him, an older male with gray hair and deep lines carved into his face by decades of war. His name was Marcus Cole, and he was a sergeant who had been fighting since before Talvarus was born. You look lost, little observer, Marcus said, offering him a metal container filled with some dark liquid. Coffee. It is terrible, but it helps you stay awake. Talvarus accepted the container, but did not drink. How do you do it? He asked. How do you fight like that, and then sit here calmly as if nothing happened? Marcus took a long drink from his own container and stared at the tent ceiling. We do not think about it. Thinking comes later, after the fighting is done. During the battle, you just move and shoot, and try to keep your friends alive. If you start thinking, you start dying. But you must feel something. Fear, anger, despair, something. Oh, we feel plenty, Marcus replied with a tired smile. We just do not let the feelings make our decisions. Fear tells you to run, but you can choose to stand. Anger tells you to make mistakes, but you can choose to stay focused. Every human learns this eventually. Our feelings are real, but they are not in charge. Talvarus thought about this for a long moment. Among my people, we believe that wisdom means avoiding conflict. We think that peaceful species are more evolved than violent ones. But watching you fight today, I am not sure that is true anymore. Marcus laughed quietly. Your people gave up violence 10,000 years ago, right? That is what the files say. You evolved past it. Yes. We learned that cooperation and understanding were more effective than aggression. And how is that working out for you against the Zythrak? The question struck Talvarus like a physical blow. He had no answer because they both knew the truth. The peaceful species of the Concordance were losing, had been losing for 3 centuries, and would continue losing until there was nothing left to lose. We hoped that others would protect us, Talvarus admitted. We hoped that the galaxy would see the value of peace. The galaxy does not care about value, Marcus said. The galaxy does not care about anything. It is just rocks and fire and empty space. The only things that matter are the choices we make and the prices we are willing to pay. Talvarus returned to his quarters later that night and accessed the classified concordance files on humanity. If he wanted to understand these creatures, he needed to know where they came from. What he found kept him awake until dawn. Humanity had evolved on a world that seemed designed to kill them. They had survived ice ages that froze their planet, volcanic eruptions that darkened their skies, plagues that wiped out entire civilizations. They had faced predators with sharper claws and stronger jaws and faster legs, and they had hunted those predators to extinction. The file described their hunting method, and Talvarus read the passage 3 times because not believe it. Humans chase their prey, not with traps or ambush, but with simple, relentless pursuit. They followed animals for hours, sometimes days, never attacking, never stopping, until their targets collapsed from exhaustion and terror. They were not the fastest or the strongest. They were simply the most persistent creatures on their world. He found records of their history and felt sick to his stomach. They had been at war with each other for their entire existence. They had invented weapons that could destroy cities in a single flash. They had built machines that could end all life on their planet, and then they had chosen not to use them. They had looked into the abyss of total annihilation and stepped back from the edge through nothing but willpower. They domesticated wolves. The file noted apex predators that could tear a human apart. They did not do this through force or violence. They did it through patience, feeding and caring for the wolves across generations until the creatures became loyal companions. They turned their enemies into friends through sheer stubborn determination, but the detail that disturbed Talvarus most was a simple observation buried in the psychological assessment. Humans do not fight only for survival. They fight for ideas. They will die and kill for concepts like freedom, honor, justice, and love. They will sacrifice themselves for strangers they have never met. They will charge into certain death, not because they want to live, but because they believe something is worth dying for. He thought about Captain Vasquez and her soldiers. He thought about their laughter and their songs and their absolute refusal to retreat. Suddenly, it all made a terrible kind of sense. These were not primitive creatures with crude weapons. These were the survivors of a world that had tried to kill them for 200,000 years. They had been forged in fire and tempered by suffering and shaped by endless conflict into something the galaxy had never seen before. The next morning, Talvarus found Captain Vasquez in the command post, studying tactical displays. Her arm had been bandaged, but she was already back at work as if the wound did not exist. "The Zythrak are sending their Ravager caste," she said without looking up. "Elite warriors, genetically engineered for combat. They have never lost a battle." Talvarus had heard of the Ravagers. They were the nightmares that even other Zythrak feared, towering monsters, with armor that could stop plasma fire and claws that could slice through steel. When the Ravagers came, worlds fell. "Will you retreat now?" he asked. Vasquez finally looked at him, and there was something in her eyes that made him take a step back, something ancient and primal and utterly without mercy. "The Ravagers have never fought humans," she said. "They do not know that fear is just fuel. They do not understand that we have been fighting things that want to kill us since we first stood upright. They think they are the predators." She turned back to her displays and began issuing orders. "All units, prepare for contact with Ravager caste. This is what we trained for. This is why we came. Show these bugs what humans are made of." Talvarus watched her work and felt something strange stirring in his chest, an emotion his peaceful species had not felt in 10,000 years. It took him a moment to recognize it. It was hope, not hope, that the humans would win. The odds were still impossible. Not hope that he would survive death seemed more likely with each passing hour, but hope that somewhere in the galaxy there existed creatures who refused to accept defeat, who fought not because they thought they could win, but because they believed some things were worth fighting for regardless of the outcome. He was beginning to understand why the cosmos might dread humanity's power. It was not their weapons or their technology or even their persistence. It was their absolute, unshakable belief that they could make a difference, that one species, one army, one soldier could stand against the darkness and say, no, and mean it. The Ravagers were coming. And every strategic calculation said the humans would be destroyed. But Talvarus had seen the look in Captain Vasquez's eyes, and he was no longer certain that strategic calculations meant anything at all. The Ravagers descended from orbit in massive drop pods that screamed through the atmosphere like falling stars. Talvarus counted 17 impacts across the ash plains, each one sending tremors through the ground and filling the sky with clouds of debris. He stood on the observation platform of Firebase Echo and watched as the pods opened and the nightmares emerged. The Ravagers were everything the reports had described and worse 3 times the height of a human, covered in black chitin that seemed to absorb light, armed with claws that could cut through starship hulls. Their eyes burned with predatory intelligence, and their mandibles dripped with venom that could melt flesh from bone. There were thousands of them. And behind them came the regular Zethrak forces, millions of warriors ready to sweep across the battlefield once the Ravagers broke the human lines. Captain Vasquez stood beside Talvarus, watching the enemy advance with an expression that might have been anticipation. Beautiful, are they not? She asked. The perfect killing machines. I almost respect them. You are going to die, Talvarus said, his voice hollow. You cannot fight those things? You cannot, probably, Vasquez agreed. But dying is easy. Giving up is hard. I have never been very good at doing hard things. The Concordance advisors had already evacuated. They had declared the battle lost and retreated to orbit, leaving only a skeleton crew of observers and their recording equipment. Talvarus had been offered a seat on the last shuttle, but he had refused. If the humans were going to die, someone needed to witness it. The Ravagers charged, and the world became a storm of fire and blood. Human weapons blazed against the advancing monsters. But the Ravagers were not like ordinary Zethrak. Plasma bolts splashed against their armor without effect. Kinetic rounds that would have shattered normal carapaces barely left scratches. They absorbed punishment that would have destroyed tanks and kept coming, their claws reaching for human flesh. The first line of defenders fell in seconds. Talvarus watched soldiers he had spoken to, soldiers he had seen laughing and singing just hours before, torn apart by claws and mandibles and venom. Their screams were lost in the thunder of weapons and the shrieking of the Ravagers, but the humans did not break. They did not run. They fell back to secondary positions and kept fighting, kept dying, kept refusing to accept what every rational calculation told them was inevitably. Ravager breached the medical tent, its claws dripping with the blood of the soldiers who had tried to stop it. Inside were the wounded humans who could not fight, could not run, could only lie on their cots and wait for death. Talvarus watched a medic, a small woman whose name he had never learned, pick up a belt of grenades and walk toward the monster. She did not run. She did not scream. She simply walked forward with calm purpose and wrapped her arms around the Ravager's leg. The explosion killed them both and brought down the tent, but the wounded inside survived. That was the trade she made, her life for theirs, and she made it without hesitation across the battlefield. Similar scenes played out again and again. A squad of soldiers held a bridge against 100 Ravagers, singing their national anthem as they died one by one, their voices growing weaker but never stopping. An engineer rigged his vehicle to explode and drove it into a cluster of enemies, laughing as the flames consumed him. A pilot whose ship had been destroyed grabbed a rifle and joined the ground troops. Fighting until a Ravager's claw finally ended her, Captain Vasquez led a counterattack against the largest group of Ravagers, her soldiers following her into certain death because she asked them to. Talvarez saw her take a claw strike that severed her arm at the elbow, saw her stumble and fall, saw the blood pouring from the wound, and then saw her pick up her rifle with her remaining hand and keep fighting. "Is this what you wanted to see?" She shouted at him across the chaos, her face twisted with pain and fury and something that looked almost like joy. "Is this what you came to understand?" Talvarez did not have an answer. He could only watch as the humans died and died and died, and refused to stop fighting. The Zythrak Hive Admiral observed the battle from his command carrier in orbit, and for the first time in his 10,000 years of existence, he felt something strange crawling through his neural network. The humans should have been destroyed hours ago. Their defenses should have crumbled. Their spirits should have broken instead. They were still fighting. Worse, they were making his Ravagers hesitate. The perfect killing machines, creatures engineered to feel nothing but hunger and rage, were slowing down, looking over their shoulders, waiting for support instead of charging forward. He searched his memory for a word to describe what he was seeing and could not find one. His species had no concept for creatures who fought when fighting was hopeless. They had no framework for understanding beings who would rather die than surrender. The translator AI in his system offered a suggestion from the human linguistic database. Dread. Yes, the Hive Admiral realized. That was what he was feeling. That was what his Ravagers were feeling. For the first time in 300 years of conquest, the Zythrak were afraid in orbit. The human fleet had been reduced to 12 ships, 12 battered, burning vessels against hundreds of Zythrak warships. By every measure of naval combat, they should have surrendered or fled hours ago instead. They broadcast a message to every human on the surface. "We are coming. Hold the line. We are coming." Then they did something that made no tactical sense, no strategic sense, no sense at all. They accelerated toward the Zythrak command carrier, not firing, not evading, just charging at maximum speed directly into the heart of the enemy fleet. The Zythrak guns tore into them, destroying ship after ship, but the humans did not change course. They did not slow down. They aimed their dying vessels at the command carrier and refused to turn away. The first human ship struck the carrier's shields and exploded. Then the second. Then the third. Each impact weakened the shields. Each sacrifice brought the remaining ships closer to their target. The Hive Admiral ordered evasive maneuvers, but his carrier was too massive, too slow. He watched through 1,000 sensors as the last human ship, a tiny destroyer called the Defiance, burned through his shields and buried itself in the carrier's hull. The explosion tore through the command decks and severed the neural links that connected the Hive Admiral to his fleet. For one terrible moment, the entire Zythrak armada went silent as the hive mind screamed in pain and confusion on the surface of Kethra 7. The Ravagers stopped. Without the Hive Admiral's guidance, they faltered, their perfect coordination broken. Their predatory confidence shattered. Captain Vasquez saw the hesitation and raised her voice above the chaos. "Now, push them back. Push them into the fire." The surviving humans, barely 1,000 left from the original 10,000, charged forward with renewed fury. They crashed into the confused Ravagers and fought with weapons, with knives, with bare hands. They screamed and bled and died, but they pushed the enemy back. Dawn broke over Kethra 7, and for the first time in 300 years, the Zythrak retreated. Not a tactical withdrawal, not a strategic repositioning, but a full retreat. Ravagers and warriors alike fleeing from a species they had thought would be easy prey. Talvarez stood in the ruins of Firebase Echo and watched the enemy run. He watched Captain Vasquez bleeding, broken, missing an arm, raise her remaining fist to the sky and scream in triumph. He watched human soldiers embrace each other, crying and laughing at the same time. He finally understood why the cosmos dreaded humanity's power. It was not because they could not be defeated. It was because defeating them meant nothing. You could kill them, wound them, destroy everything they had built, and they would still fight. They would still refuse to give up. They would still find a way to hurt you, to slow you down, to make you pay for every inch of ground. The Zithrak had won every battle before this one, because their enemies eventually lost hope. But humans did not seem to have a breaking point. They did not know how to stop believing they could win. And against that kind of enemy, victory was impossible, because they would never, ever accept defeat. The morning after the battle was quiet in a way that felt almost sacred. The guns had stopped, the screaming had ended, and the only sounds were the wind blowing across the ash plains and the soft voices of survivors calling out to each other. Talvarus walked through the ruins of Firebase, Echo, and counted the cost of victory. Of the 10,000 humans who had landed on Kethris 7, only 847 still breathed. The rest lay scattered across the battlefield, their bodies broken, but their faces strangely peaceful. As if they had found something in death that made the dying worthwhile, the survivors did not mourn, not yet. Instead, they gathered in the center of the firebase and did something that Talvarus would never forget. They celebrated. They opened containers of alcohol that had somehow survived the battle. They passed around rations and shared stories of fallen friends. They laughed and cried and held each other like family members reunited after a long separation. They raised their voices in songs that spoke of home and hope and the unbreakable bonds between warriors who had faced death together. Captain Vasquez sat apart from the celebration, a medical technician attaching a crude prosthetic to the stump of her arm. The device was ugly and functional, a metal claw that whirred and clicked when she moved it, but she examined it with something like satisfaction. Talus approached her slowly, his mind full of questions he did not know how to ask. She looked up at him and smiled, a tired, genuine smile that made her scarred face almost beautiful. "You stayed," she said. "I did not think you would. Most observers run when the shooting starts. I needed to understand," Talvarus replied. "I still need to understand. Why do you fight like this? What makes you so willing to die?" Vasquez flexed her new mechanical hand and watched the fingers open and close. "Do you really want to know?" "More than anything." She was silent for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was softer than Talvarus had ever heard it. "When I was a child, my grandmother told me a story. She said that long ago, before humans had fire or tools or language, we lived in a world full of predators. We were small and weak and terrified, and every night we huddled together in the darkness and prayed that the monsters would not find us." Vasquez looked up at the smoke-filled sky, her eyes distant. "But one day, one of our ancestors decided that hiding was not enough. She picked up a rock and stood at the entrance to the cave and waited for the monsters to come. She was terrified. She knew she would probably die, but she stood there anyway, because the alternative was watching her family be devoured." "Did she survive?" Talvarus asked. "The story does not say. It does not matter. What matters is that she stood. She made a choice to fight even when fighting seemed hopeless. And because she made that choice, we are here, her children, her legacy, her gift to the future." Vasquez turned to face him, and her eyes held the same ancient fire that Talvarus had seen on the battlefield. "That is why we fight. Not because we think we can win, not because we want to die, but because somewhere out there, something is threatening people who cannot fight back. As long as one of us draws breath, that is not allowed." Talvarus felt tears forming in his eyes, an involuntary response that his species used to express overwhelming emotion. "I understand now," he whispered. "I finally understand." 1 week later, Talvarus stood before the Concordance High Council in the Great Chamber on Volanthos Prime. 12 elder species had gathered to hear his report on the Battle of Kethra 7, and they expected data tactical analyses, weapon specifications, casualty projections instead. He told them the truth. Humans are not stronger than us, he began, his voice echoing through the ancient hall. They are not smarter. Their ships are crude. Their weapons are primitive. By every objective measure, they should have lost the battle for Kethra 7. They should have been destroyed in the first hour. The council members shifted in their seats, confused by his words. Admiral Vexthos, the same Morvathi who had mocked the humans before the battle, leaned forward with narrowed eyes. But they were not destroyed. Talvarus continued. They won? They drove back the Zythrak Ravager, caste creatures that have never known defeat, and they made the hive mind itself feel fear. How did they do this? That is the question you sent me to answer. He paused, gathering his thoughts, trying to find words that could capture what he had witnessed. Humans possess something that we have lost or perhaps never had. They believe they can win. Not hope, not faith, not desperate optimism. Certainty. Absolute, unshakable certainty that they can make a difference. And when a human is certain, Talvarus said, his voice rising, the universe itself seems to bend. They do not accept defeat because defeat is simply not possible in their minds. They do not give up because giving up has never occurred to them as an option. They fight and bleed and die, and somehow, impossibly, they win. Ambassador Kethril spoke from her seat among the Volanthi delegation. What would you have us do, young historian? We cannot change our nature. We cannot become like them. No, Talvarus agreed. But we can stand beside them. We can support them. We can give them our resources and our technology and our knowledge. And in return, they will do what we cannot. They will fight for us, protect us, stand between us and the darkness. The council debated for 3 days. Some argued that humans were too dangerous, too unpredictable, too alien in their thinking. Others pointed to the battle for Kethra 7 and asked what alternative they had. In the end, the vote was unanimous. Humanity was elevated to full membership in the Galactic Concordance, not as allies, not as partners, but as protectors. The species that had been dismissed as primitive, rock throwers, was now the shield that would guard civilization against the Zythrak and whatever other horrors. The galaxy might produce. Captain Vasquez attended the ceremony via holographic transmission, her mechanical arm gleaming in the light of 100 stars. When the council asked if humanity accepted the role of protector, she smiled that terrible, beautiful smile and spoke words that would be remembered for millennia. We did not come to the stars to conquer, she said. We came because we heard someone crying for help. As long as there is suffering in the universe, as long as there are those who cannot defend themselves, humans will answer. That is not a duty or a burden, it is who we are. Years passed. The war against the Zythrak continued, but now the Concordance fought back with human warriors at the front of every battle. World after world was liberated. The hive mind's expansion slowed, then stopped, then began to reverse. For the first time in 3 centuries, the galaxy dared to hope Dolavaris Okum completed his definitive history of the Battle of Kethra 7 and published it to universal acclaim. Scholars across 1,000 worlds studied his words, trying to understand the strange species that had changed everything. Book's final line became the most quoted passage in galactic literature. Carved into monuments, taught in schools, whispered like a prayer by those who had lost hope and found it again. I asked the cosmos why it fears humanity. Talvarus wrote, The cosmos answered, because they do not fear me. And somewhere across the vast darkness of space, human soldiers laughed and sang and prepared for the next battle, not because they wanted to fight, not because they enjoyed killing, But because someone, somewhere, needed their help, there was enough. That was always enough. That was what made them human.